So thanks again for everyone who's joining us for this webinar to walk through some of the key content of OrgCode's newly released Diversion and Housing Loss Prevention Guide. My name is Marie Morrison. I'm the Director of Built for Zero Canada with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I am your host for today's webinar. Our presenter is none other than Iain De Jong, President and CEO of OrgCode Consulting, who is both an expert and a lifelong learner in the work to end homelessness. We will begin with a land acknowledgement, and I invite you to put your own land acknowledgement in the chat, and I see that some people had already been doing that. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I am located in Kitchener, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral peoples, whose presence on these lands continue to this day. This webinar is being brought to you today from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, which leads a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada, and includes the 6 key initiatives that you see listed here. And just a bit of housekeeping before we jump into our topic today. We are, of course, recording this webinar. It will be posted on a website I will show you more about in a moment. Closed captioning has been enabled, and I think you can choose to have that show or not. Everyone is muted. You can ask questions though through the chat or question function, and I think we'll largely take those questions at the end. Everyone is encouraged to also use the chat to reflect on and just highlight what you're hearing, just share your ideas, share what's happening in your community. That was not supposed to happen. So the website that I was referencing is the Canadian Alliance Training and Technical Assistance website. This is where you will find the session recording after we're done under Webinar Archive. And while the regular series of webinars that had been sponsored by Reaching Home has now ended, this is where you can also find any webinars that CH is continuing to offer on a more ad hoc basis, and there are a few that are posted there now. And just wanted you to know about one upcoming related webinar that you might be particularly interested in, Diversion in Practice. In which Waterloo Region, who first began implementing diversion almost 10 years ago, will be sharing its current evolution of what is now called First Connect, a team offering 24/7 diversion and prevention support and serving as the central point of access for most shelters across the region. Also on this webinar, you'll hear briefly about 2 Canadian research projects that are underway, at least one of which involves Waterloo Region. So I will be putting this registration link into the chat right now. And here it comes. So just wanted you to also know where you can find a host of diversion resources on our website. So under resources and under program areas, and then this is the program areas page with all sorts of program areas. You click on diversion, that will bring you to this drop-down menu where we have overview information, guides and self-assessments, use-related information and tools, community diversion program examples, sample diversion tools and forms, information about HIFAS foreign diversion, and this is where we'll put all the webinars that we have as well related to diversion. So under that drop-down menu, under OrgCode resources, this is where you will find the new Diversion and Housing Loss Prevention Guide. And Iain will be speaking to some of the key contents of this guide. Part 1, we've got an overview of diversion and housing loss prevention. Part 2, all on diversion. Part 3, housing loss prevention, some great diversion case studies and information and tools here. And with no further ado, I will turn it over to Iain.
Thanks, Marie. To everybody central and east, good afternoon. To everybody mountain and west, good morning. Happy to be joining you today on the last day of May to walk you through the guidance on prevention and diversion. And really in this webinar, wanting to outline the materials that you'll find in the guidebook prepared by Tracy Flaherty-Wilmot and myself, trying to assist organizations and communities that really want to make sure that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring, and putting a considerable emphasis on the front door of services. How do we connect to people effectively prior to an experience of homelessness, but also acknowledging that in the practice of diversion, it can shift into rapid resolution, resulting in continuing the process of rapidly resolving someone's homelessness if we can't divert at the front door. Slide. So I want to start with an overview of diversion and housing loss prevention. This is known as part 1 of the guidebook. And in this section, what I want to do is highlight the framing that we've taken to look at diversion and prevention. We've done this based upon our research that continues in this area of diversion and housing loss prevention. And a big part of that research has also been the great experiences we've had with practitioners, both in Canada and the United States, that have really embraced the importance of housing loss prevention and diversion, and taking away some of what they've learned and some of which they were challenged by in the process to make sure that that is named in the guidance for your consideration moving forward. So there's a few key terms that we need to make sure we're on the same page. These terms sometimes get confused or used interchangeably at the community level. And so the first thing that we want to do is make sure that we're on the same page. Prevention is really about what happens before someone has lost their ability to reside at a particular address. The goal is to sustain existing safe and appropriate housing. And there's really 2 different types of prevention activities we want to make sure that we're embracing in our work of prevention. The first is eviction prevention. And this is predominantly what people have thought about historically when thinking about prevention. Someone has a legal lease in their name. Think of someone who's like living in a bachelor, they have a signed lease, and now the landlord is moving forward with some violation of the conditions of the lease, usually to have the person vacate. So that's what eviction prevention is. We want to make sure, though, that there is consideration and practice of prevention with housing loss. So these will be those instances where the household is not the legal leaseholder, but is still in a safe and appropriate housing situation. This can be someone staying in a relative's spare bedroom, could also include some forms of subletting. So the individual, not the leaseholder, so doesn't have the same protections and rights that a leaseholder would, but if it's safe and appropriate, we want to make sure that we're also putting efforts into sustaining those types of housing situations whenever possible. As we move into the next slide, we have the opportunity to take a look at diversion and rapid resolution. So diversion would be once the individual couple or family has lost housing, but prior to shelter entry. This is usually a very short period of time. The emphasis is on securing safe and appropriate options in community rather than a shelter stay. So when we think about diversion in the sense, there can be some overlap or gray area between what constitutes housing loss prevention and where does diversion set in. But that is not something that we really have to put very firm boundaries along. In particular, if your community or your organization is set up to make seamless transitions from prevention activities to diversion activities. Rapid resolution, a term that is very popular in parts of the United States, increasing in popularity in Canada, is really about trying to assist the household in leaving shelter for a safe and appropriate place within a few weeks of their shelter stay. In some communities and some organizations in Canada, they are still labeling these activities as diversion. And while it is related to diversion, I think that it can get to a place where it's confusing to continue to use the diversion term. I get where people are trying to say we're diverting from a longer term shelter stay or we're diverting away from chronic homelessness. but probably best that we start referring to those sorts of activities as rapid resolution and/or seeing rapid resolution as a subset or a continuation of the activities that started in the diversion process. Slide. To make any sort of engagement in housing loss prevention diversion work, it's really important that we understand and support resilience. When we think about understanding and supporting resilience, it comes down to a series of questions that can be good conversation starters within your organization, within organizations and across organizations that do prevention and diversion work. But it's not necessarily a bad conversation to be having as part of a community in your planning processes and as you think about resource allocation on an annual basis or whatever your funding cycle is. This is really starting to frame the way in which we think about the people that we're going to have the privilege of serving through prevention and diversion, and whether or not we're really taking the time to appreciate the desire of most people in most situations to not experience homelessness. So we want to know whether or not there's a shared belief that people can quickly recover from adversity. So is there the ability to support people if that's the case? Whether or not we take a strengths-based approach during housing crisis intervention and problem-solving opportunities, and how do we examine and understand both those individual and environmental strengths and put them into practice? Whether or not your organization, fellow organizations, or community believe that people do have elasticity and can bounce back, and that helping professionals such as yourselves have the ability to optimize this capacity, and whether or not you believe that people can navigate to the resources they need and negotiate engagement with appropriate resources. So that ability to continue to work on resolving whatever particular housing crisis situation that they're in. When we think about resilience, it is not a character trait that people have or don't have. It is in fact something that can be discovered within people. And as we work on resilience, what we're really trying to do is decrease the impact of the stress of the situation by helping that individual couple or family focus on what they are capable of doing amidst that adversity. Slide. When we think about the strengths-based approach, those individual and environmental strengths, it really is about understanding what people are bringing to the table by way of their own problem-solving skills, creativity, what they've already tried, what they've thought about trying, but haven't implemented, similar situations they might have found themselves in historically, how they resolve those situations and not experience homelessness. Environmental strengths really about resources and their social network. So what are those pieces of the puzzle beyond themselves that they can bring into the conversation with you or another allied professional in talking through housing loss prevention or diversion? When we think about using a strengths-based approach, it's really important as we journey through the steps that are taken in diversion and prevention to be acknowledging that which people are capable of rather than immediately focusing on barriers. And as we are focusing on what people are capable of, encouraging not just a conversation, but follow through action and implementation in this regard. Slide. The guide also talks about the importance of knowing community resources well. This is true for both prevention activities as well as diversion activities. And as you look through this list, I don't want you to fret if your particular organization or community doesn't have some of these resources. Most of the organizations or communities that we're aware of that do prevention and diversion well have increased these resources over time. So they maybe didn't have everything to start, but that didn't prevent or stop them from starting. It's not like they said, okay, well, we need to have all these particular resources aligned and ready to go prior to implementing. What they have learned is which ones to add, how to get them, and in some of those communities that are still doing prevention diversion well, continuing to grow in this regard. So I want to highlight what these resources really mean at a high level, knowing that they're discussed in greater detail in the guide. So the first is the idea of flexible funding. There will obviously be instances, if you've done prevention or diversion, I'm sure you're well aware, where there is no existing funding source to pay for some of the things that you might want to pay for that would keep a household house. So when your provincial or territorial income supports and benefits wouldn't pay for a particular thing, so for example, some provinces will pay for people to return to a home community, some won't through income assistance, that might be an opportunity of flexible funding. Or you might find that you'll see later down the list storage assistance. Well, if you're not providing the storage assistance directly, sometimes flexible funding has been used to pay for short-term storage or moving and relocating from one address to another. Basically, whatever doesn't neatly fit in your existing homelessness funding resources or your provincial or territorial income support resources may be captured underneath flexible funding. When we think about flexible funding, we want there to be guides, but not rigid rules. We want it to be activated really quickly, but in the spirit of creativity. We want it to be funding amounts that can have an impact, but don't require 7 layers of signatures and a check that's cut 3 weeks from now. This has to be the sort of resources, sometimes even directly through a petty cash type function or an organization's credit card, that can pay for things really quickly as needed. Utility arrears, fairly straightforward. Rental arrears, pretty straightforward. We'll talk a little bit about the application of those and when. Motel assistance can be used for short-term reprieve. It also can be used as a form of interim accommodation as you're still working through diversion. Family and friend reunification, if not available in your community, is certainly something that you can focus time and attention on, whether those family or friends are in the same community where the prevention diversion is being applied, or elsewhere in the province or territory, somewhere else in the country. And some prevention programs and diversion programs even allow for travel internationally for reunification. Damages and repairs to save a tenancy can be really helpful. Again, we've learned a lot around the parameters that usually go into damages and repairs to make sure that we're not getting nickel and dimed for normal wear and tear, but really about salvaging a tenancy or safe housing situation where it's appropriate to do so. Transportation assistance can be local, can be regional, can be broader than that. Storage assistance, if not provided through your organization, perhaps the community is providing storage opportunities. Gift cards for food and gas usually fits into short-term problem solving in diversion when someone does have the ability to get to a safe alternative other than shelter, but either needs the ability to have fuel to get there or needs to address the situation once they are there by contributing towards the likes of food. There are other instances where gift cards for food can help out in freeing up a meager amount of money for the household to put towards sustaining their safe place to live, but that would mean that they're food insecure, and so the provision of food gift cards can be another tool used. Shelter location and availability, especially for transitioning from diversion to rapid resolution. We want people to know where the opportunities are for them to get safe and appropriate shelter in the community. Kenneling options for animals, usually pets, usually the likes of cats and dogs, and not exclusively that. And this is predominantly for when there's a small transition period where it can be really challenging and stressful to care for an animal. And I appreciate that many people don't want to be away from their animals for the emotional supports and other reasons, but as part of the problem solving, it might even be just a day or two that can really be helpful while sorting through a housing crisis. Where are the food banks and meal programs in the community? When and how is voluntary trusteeship available in the community? How might that fit into broader money management and financial education matters? Income support resources, how do people apply for general assistance? What's the state of their file? What does it mean to apply for disability? Assistance with taxes, especially if it relates to making other resources available and the ability to continue to Work on accessing those other resources is predicated upon having one's taxes current. It can be helpful to make sure we know where the community-based free or very low-cost tax assistance resources are, because we will encounter some people who are leaving abusive situations. We want to make sure that we are absolutely aware of domestic and intimate partner violence survivor resources in the community, how to activate them, and having a strong workflow that's easily understood. What are the faith-based resources? So if there are churches, temples, mosques, synagogues, etc., that participate, or their congregation participates in any sort of homelessness or housing support resources, who are those entities? How do we access it? When can we access it? What resources exist for veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces? There are a number of resources that are available exclusively to veterans, and ways of accessing those resources that can be very helpful. And then in the prevention resources, and in particular on the eviction prevention side of things, knowing your community legal resources, so like legal aid, community-based legal clinics, how to activate it, and really having a good local conversation with leadership within community-based legal resources around when it is most advantageous in the prevention workflow to engage with them. Usually the further upstream, the better, but also, and perhaps more importantly, getting a clear understanding of essentially what's their cutoff. So if someone were like days away from an eviction as opposed to 2 weeks away from eviction, would that make a difference in your community based upon the legal processes of challenging an eviction? We always want to make sure that there's a safety screening at the front end. Doesn't matter if you're doing eviction prevention, other forms of housing loss prevention, or diversion. We want to make sure that the person or a couple or a family member that's engaged with you is safe. And we think a lot about safety from physical violence, but we also want to make sure that people are in emotionally safe situations, that they're not experiencing mental abuse and anguish being in the environment of others. And so working through a clear workflow so that every person who might engage in diversion or prevention knows that before they get into the practical steps of implementing their specific service, whether that's prevention or diversion, that we have screened for safety. If we do encounter someone who's in an unsafe situation, we do not proceed with the diversion and prevention guidance as laid out. What it's going to suggest is that your community outlines exactly what measures to take from that point of understanding a safety risk moving forward, and that will take precedent over any other steps in diversion and prevention. We also want to make sure that when you are engaged in any sort of prevention or diversion activity with people, that engagement is happening in a safe place. So that can be empowering people to have a voice of where they want to have a conversation. If it's not happening over the phone, if it's happening in person, do they want to go to an enclosed office? Do they want a more public area? Do they want to go for a walk and have the conversation? But where are they going to feel safest to engage with you in this problem solving related to their housing crisis? Slide. Prevention and diversion activities focus a lot on how we initially engage, to develop more immediate rapport and trust, to really understand from their perspective what they think is going on before we go into our series of steps and procedures for diversion or prevention. So when we think about a relationship foundation having two parts, that engagement part can be really open-ended questions like, tell me how you're feeling, tell me generally what's going on, what's happening. Those sorts of initial engagements, usually open-ended, usually eliciting some sort of emotional response and some sort of a high-level understanding of what's been occurring. Focusing is where we get into not just what exactly has transpired, but figuring out what exactly will come next. Is this particular housing crisis solvable? If so, what does that look like? What are the responsibilities of different entities in that pursuit? And how do we get to a place where we've examined contingencies in the event that the initial plan doesn't work? So rapport, trust, definitely necessary, starting at a more open-ended level, getting to a more focused conversation. Slide. Both prevention and diversion are predicated upon problem solving. And when we think about problem solving, one of the things that we have certainly found in organizations that do prevention and diversion well is they don't see the person as the problem. They see the problem as the problem. The problem is workable, the problem might be fixable, but the person is not the thing that we're trying to fix. Their housing crisis situation is. So we need to acknowledge that when we go through a problem-solving process in our mind, that we don't want to make assumptions. We don't want to be in a position where we automatically just relate one situation that we're seeing with someone for the first time to another encounter with a different household that might be similar, but we still have to acknowledge uniqueness. And so we start with identifying the issue or the issues. Now, just in step one alone, in monitoring and evaluating different prevention diversion programs, we can see this being perhaps one of the biggest struggles that occurs. So someone says things like, well, I can't stay at my sister's house anymore. And we say, aha, well, the issue is, Buddy can't stay at his sister's house anymore. But identifying the issue means understanding, well, why can't you stay at your sister's house anymore? So it's this reason behind, or it might be, yes, the last step was that you were told you could no longer live there, but prior to that, there might have been other conflicts or issues that needed to be resolved and addressed. So let's make sure that we take our time to identify the issue or issues and understand everyone's interests, not just the person in front of you's interests, but perhaps what's their landlord's interest, or what's their sister's interests, what's your organization's interest, what's the community's interests, why are we interested is a good question that often helps us identify which entities actually do have an interest that needs to be considered. We then want to work with the individual couple or family to list possible solutions. So we are often in the note taker, they are often in the creative brainstorming space of what are all the different things that they might be able to do. We then lead people through a process where they evaluate the options. We don't evaluate the options for them and tell them what's going to be best or worst. We lead them through a process where they deliberate and discern what's going to be best. And through that process of deliberating and discerning, get to a place where they select the option or options that they think will be best for them in their circumstances relative to their skills, their strengths, and their particular housing crisis situation. We then go about documenting the agreement, what's going to happen next, how it's going to happen. The documentation of agreement, if you were putting in resources in, like some flexible funding, let's say, that would also be the opportunity to document that tool that was used in the process. And the seventh step, one that is sometimes missed in the problem solving part, is figuring out what plan B and even plan C might be in the event that the initial foray into prevention and diversion is unsuccessful. So they selected an option, it didn't work. What is the second best option or the third best option? And can we continue to work with people through the relationship foundation to try those other options as well, as opposed to one and done? I tried one thing, it didn't work, and now I want shelter and other services. We also want to have some sort of agreement on monitoring and evaluation. So as a community, we might decide if prevention or diversion is applied and the person never comes back to the system that it was successful, Others, programs and services in the space may continue a relationship with people for a short period of time. Some community-based prevention programs even offer short-term case management assistance for a period of 2 to 3 months to continue to support that household after the initial prevention engagement. Slide. So first up, I want to talk about prevention, and then I'll get into diversion, and then we'll take time for questions. So on the prevention side of things, what we're really aiming at again is understanding both eviction prevention and housing loss prevention. This is usually more upstream than imminent housing loss. Usually when prevention is talked about in many jurisdictions, when they say the prevention is going to be occurring, it's usually a time frame of 60 days or less. And in your community, with your income supports and resources available, you might want to evaluate what sort of time frame makes the most sense for you. Certainly my experience through evaluation, the sooner a preventing organization is aware of a housing crisis, the more that can be brought to bear to assist the household. The sooner we get to the actual eviction date or housing loss date, the more difficult it is to do prevention. Slide. So one of the major challenges with prevention has been what has been happening in practice for a long time, decades in some instances, and what the research has actually shown generally haven't lined up well, particularly in the Canadian context. So one of the most fulsome researchers in this area, Mary Shin, has done a number of studies, including being involved in control group studies, where a group of people get prevention resources and another group doesn't, and then we track how they do over time. The key insights from that research, and there's other Canadian researchers in the space as well, have found that the majority of investments actually went to households that never would have become homeless, even if prevention supports were not provided. So what does that tell us? It tells us that a lot of our investment is going to the wrong group of people. Second key insight, that no household should be deemed too high risk to be supported in preventing literal homelessness. Why is this important? Well, many prevention programs historically in Canada have looked for things like stable sources of income, have tried to determine that it was a short-term, unexpected event that made someone worthy of investment, and that the lower the risk of the household was seen as the best investment. This research, as well as reviewing the application of other prevention diversion programs, has clearly demonstrated that really households, individuals, couples, or families with really high needs are great candidates for prevention, and in fact are the best candidates for prevention. And the third key insight is that a focus on reducing homelessness demanded a shift to targeted prevention services for highly vulnerable households. We don't have more money than we know what to do with. We have to spend the money that we have really wisely. We do want to make sure that we're reducing inflow, and so we've got to make sure that highly vulnerable households stay housed. This includes giving consideration to every household that's being supported in a community through, let's say, an intensive case management program or supportive housing program or shared community treatment team, be seen as a highly vulnerable household that we are, through active case management, in essence, performing a type of prevention. Slide. So, whereas historically programs required households to have that eviction notice or be below certain income thresholds or had to be able to demonstrate sustainability and or demonstrate the reason for falling behind was not a fault of their own, what we've really come to appreciate through the research and practice of some pioneering organizations in particular is that we really need to put our emphasis on households that are higher needs. What we want to make sure is that households that wouldn't have entered homelessness anyway aren't getting the majority of prevention resources. And this is a challenge for many organizations and communities, We need to do a better job parsing out those activities within the homeless response system that are truly about homelessness prevention and homelessness diversion, and which interventions are actually an extension of poverty alleviation. So this can be a challenge when a lot of poverty alleviation work has sat within the prevention sphere in some communities for a long period of time. People will often make an argument that it's very much upstream prevention to engage in like poverty alleviation. And I agree that poverty alleviation would likely result in less homelessness. However, it's not the policy sphere within which the homelessness system really operates within. And because we're so finitely focused on homelessness prevention, as opposed, which is more imminent in nature, broader policy alleviation initiatives are probably not a good fit for using your prevention resources for. Slide. As we think about what we're trying to do in prevention to move forward, we really want to make sure that communities are being thoughtful around who the targeted audience is. So you may want to look at existing data on the characteristics of people experiencing sheltered or unsheltered homelessness in communities, saying, okay, those would be really good candidates for prevention. That we definitely, based upon what the research has shown, want to prioritize people that have already experienced homelessness historically. The only predictor thus far that has been proven in the research has been if you're homeless once, you're more likely to be homeless again. We're trying to make sure that that cycle doesn't continue. Spending your prevention dollars on households that spend more than 50% of their monthly income on rent is actually a very good approach to prevention. And we also want to make sure that the program also serves on the housing loss side of things, people that don't have the protections or whatever your residential tenancy legislation is in your province or territory. We want to make sure that when we look at that, in addition to eviction prevention, that we're absolutely limiting the number of people who come into homelessness when they have safe and appropriate alternatives. Slide. So making sure that we target it to highly vulnerable households. If people are in rent-geared income housing, subsidized housing, supportive housing, great candidates for prevention. There's probably going to already be much of the same households that we're looking to engage. We also want to make sure that there's universal screening for our highly housing insecure households to make sure that we have addressed potential issues in our design. We want to make sure that we are not reinforcing systemic and structural discrimination against any population group. It can be very good practice in your community as you work through your prevention diversion steps to work through the outline of your framework and your approach with different communities or population groups within your community to get their input on process refinements as well as verbiage, how information is stored and used, etc. Slide. So the general prevention steps are as follows. There's the initial screening, where we want to understand what has led them to a place where they're seeking services, whether or not they're an eligible candidate, whether or not we want to make sure that they're in a position where they're really in a prevention opportunity as opposed to a diversion opportunity. We then want to explain the process. So how does prevention actually work within your organization or across your community? Be precise, try to avoid like very vague terms. Don't say things like, well, it depends or everybody's different. Explain the process. There's certain of these themes that are consistently applied. We then want to determine their current housing situation and best understand whether or not it would be appropriate, because we already screened for safety, whether or not it would just be appropriate to try to sustain the current housing situation, perhaps is untenable for other reasons that preventing it wouldn't be in anyone's best interest. So for example, a severe overcrowding situation. We then want to explore options to address the current housing situation. So what could that look like? Is it mediation and problem solving? Is it utility arrears? Is it getting connected to a community legal clinic? Like, what is it? Then create the action plan, initial steps of implementation. Where do we go from this initial prevention meeting and engagement through to a place where action is actually happening? And then, as I previously noted, follow up when appropriate. There are some organizations that can provide short-term case management assistance on a very limited basis, but other types of follow-up might include emails, texts, or phone calls. In some instances, just to follow up to see how the problem solving went in action. Follow-up when appropriate could also include other entities that were involved in the prevention. So like following up with a specific landlord after you work through a process of using some other tools and resources to ensure that they are satisfied on a go-forward basis. Slide. And now, briefly, before we, the last part of the conversation I wanted to have with you today is outlining the diversion part of the manual. In the diversion part of the manual, what we're really talking about is homelessness diversion for those individuals, couples, and families for whom either eviction or housing loss prevention was unsuccessful, or, as I'm sure you've experienced, some households that don't engage in any prevention and immediately appear for homelessness resources. We didn't even have the opportunity to engage in prevention. So when we think about a household that is coming to us for shelter services, we engage in the process of diversion, it's really important that we see this as an actual process to be delivered, whether it's part of centralized intake into the shelter system, whether that's front door intake of specific shelters, whether that's a specific worker or set of workers, or whether this is more of a skill that is applicable to any generalist that works in the space of shelter services to try to assist people with finding safe and appropriate alternatives. There's also value, as has been learned in some communities, of ensuring street outreach is also fully versed in diversion, especially if their contact-based approach to street outreach results in encountering people that have just experienced homelessness. Slide. So some people erroneously think diversion is about saying no. Diversion is not about saying no to a service. It's about understanding the unique strengths and circumstances that the household finds themselves in to deliver a service to solve their housing crisis or instability in the moment. Diversion is the service, not the absence of a service. But in order to do diversion well, we have to deepen our understanding of what their current situation is. And what I mean by that is there are a number of people who have already decided in their minds they have no alternatives. They show up at shelter, they want shelter services. I've encountered staff in shelter who say diversion is dumb. If someone gets this far, there's no way that there's something else that they possibly could have engaged in. Even if that was true, there's nothing else that could have happened. Taking the time to understand the current situation can be so beneficial for rapid resolution. Because in rapid resolution, we acknowledge that there may be instances where short-term shelter stay is entirely appropriate and warranted, and it might just take us a few more days to activate a plan that will get them out of homelessness rapidly and into a place where they have either the security of tenure or the safety that comes with being with a family or friend who wants them to be with them in that environment, and it doesn't impact their tenancy or result in housing loss for them. Slide. So the general steps of diversion, Safety screening, if it wasn't previously done, if it already happened as part of prevention, we may want to update or confirm the safety screening, but making sure the safety screening is always done first. We then explain the process of diversion before we launch into diversion, so that people understand that it is a service, what type of service it is, when and how it happens, which is often right now with whoever the worker is, and what the different steps are that are going to go through. We then look at the urgency of today. So what's led them to a place where they're seeking service today? Why weren't they here yesterday? Why aren't they here tomorrow? This usually outlines an event or circumstance that has emerged as a problem that has decreased the ability to stay housed, and where homelessness seems to be the only option for people. This is where we also do some brainstorming with people to understand what have they already tried that didn't work, as well as what have they thought about trying that they haven't tried yet. Maybe it's because they didn't have a phone or a computer, or it will require some sort of conversation with a family member to try to resolve the past conflict and move forward. We then want to understand where people stayed the night previous, whether that was a safe and appropriate place. Was it their own accommodation? Because that could result in going back to prevention, not diversion. Maybe it was that they stayed with the family member or friend the previous night and even for a period of time, in which case this might look more like housing loss prevention than diversion. Again, totally fine, but where were they last night? We might also uncover some safety situations where we learn where people stayed last night, especially if they stayed in a place unfit for permanent human habitation, or where they exchange goods or sometimes exchange sex for a place to live. Then we want the story behind the story of last night's stay. What are the events that led up to the place they're at last night? What has generally been going on in a more broader sense? What are the things that I haven't asked you about that would be important for me to know to assist you, is another way of looking at that question. If where they stayed last night was safe, then we want to explore deeply what it would take for them to stay at that place again tonight. In other words, what's the obstacle of continuing to stay in that safe and appropriate place? If they can't, absolutely cannot continue to stay in that place, then we look at, are there any other options for where they could stay temporarily? Maybe another family member, maybe a friend, maybe a coworker or previous coworker, previous neighbors, people that they've met in other programs, really exploring generally other places that people could stay temporarily. Then understanding what's getting in the way and what sort of assistance is required. So what is the ask of you or your colleagues in this process from the individual couple or family seeking assistance? If we're really open to listening as opposed to instructing in this step, it can be really helpful as people give us either explicit or at least clues of understanding how they can best be supported. We then want to understand what current resources they have, both those individual and environmental resources, and then go about housing planning with the individual, acknowledging to fully realize some plans on diversion, people will need to come into shelter for a short period of time. Slide. These and other details are outlined more fulsomely in the guide document. You'll also find that there's some case studies both for diversion and prevention that may be helpful for you to think through, may be helpful for you and your colleagues that do similar work in your organization or across your community to consider and to move forward with your thinking or even your ask for funding on the importance of diversion and prevention. This is going to bring my part of the presentation to a close as Maureen puts up my contact details, and then I'll be looking to see if there's any particular questions. Are there in the chat function or maybe through the Q&A, I'm not sure. where people might have chimed in where they want clarification, more detail, or have another question that's related to prevention or diversion.
Great. Thanks so much, Iain. Yeah, we are going to do questions and discussion, but just to say that also you will find in the slide deck Iain's information here and org codes as well as Canadian Alliance. So we will just come back to our questions and discussion and see if anything's come in the chat or the questions. I don't see anything yet, but Iain, you know, I always have like some questions and things that I would love to hear from you. I'm wondering what you think of some considerations if people are considering centralized versus sort of decentralized prevention and diversion models.
Yeah, so the short answer is they got pros and cons, and what's applicable in one community may not be applicable in others. Sometimes that's because of scale, sometimes that's because of the number of service providers, and sometimes that's because it's a great idea to do some centralized work, but you've got to resource it for it to be really successful over time. You can't have a very small staff centralized intake with very large staff prevention diversion resources where the bottleneck becomes the centralized intake. But the benefits, it really allows for good system navigation, leveraging where there are available resources, up to and including shelter stays when necessary. So the centralized prevention diversion can become a more centralized portal for shelter access, which again, depending upon scale of community, can be a remarkably helpful thing. The other thing that centralized approaches do, I think, quite well is allows for really good data tracking over time, in particular those households that may find their way repeatedly back into the place where diversion or prevention is being applied. So I think there's some value to it in that, in terms of data collection and understanding the characteristics of those households in a local community. The last thing I'd say by way of the central approach, though, is acknowledge that there can be street-based diversion in particular, not so much on the prevention. There can be some, but a lot of it can be street-based diversion. And we don't want an outreach worker to have to say to someone, you know what, we can help you. You've just got to call this number or go, 4 blocks over and 6 blocks up and you'll find the central office. We have to have some flexibility of being able to take access points to people as well.
That's great. Okay, we do have some questions coming in, and while we're taking these questions, I'm also just going to launch a poll for people just to give some feedback. So first question, based on the guide covered in the seminar, what system stakeholders make the most sense to fund in order to have the most impact?
So I think that if your community has housing help centers, there can be good candidates on the prevention side of things. I think multi-service organizations, so ones that can do some of the stuff like assistance with taxes and trusteeship and help with housing help, and maybe they also happen to have a food security program and maybe a young parents program and those sorts of things. Multi-service organizations, particularly in rural and smaller communities, tends to work well. I would really love to see diversion resources invested in either in shelters or in some sort of centralized approach. We can't just keep asking shelters to do more with the staffing that they have.
Okay, another question. What about RGI housing agencies that will only put individuals on the list if they are in shelter? It's very hard to divert those folks who are determined to get an RGI unit. Any thoughts?
Yeah, stop that practice is my short answer. I mean, the challenge there is, again, sometimes they're localized, sometimes they're more regional or even provincial. But when we get to a place where we start to look at, rigidity around RGI applications require shelter stay, if we can get it to include people who have received prevention or diversion resources, so maybe the RGI operator doesn't want to make it open to everybody, but is willing to put it in for like a pre-homeless intervention. That can sometimes be helpful. But I also think that when we say to people the pathway to an RGI unit is through shelter, it makes prevention diversion really difficult if the person is just seeking RGI housing. It incentivizes homelessness, which I think is the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish.
That's great. So we have just maybe one more question, because I'm not seeing others come in. Iain, have you seen any good sort of practices in community? Because I often hear by the time people come, you know, that situation you identified, like they are so past prevention. Like any programs where people have done a good job promoting themselves or doing other activities that would help you kind of be able to intervene just a little bit earlier?
Yeah, I think that this can be a space where there's early detection in like food security programs, drop-in centers, family assistance, and educational resources. I find getting the word out to like early on centers, libraries, income support offices, so that we can have some, not just kind of feelers out there in the community early on when people might be experiencing housing instability, but also education and advertising. Like if you find yourself in this situation, contact us as soon as possible. We don't want to make it sound like generalized housing help where anybody and everybody under the sun should apply, but really coming back down to if you're at imminent risk, and describe what imminent risk looks like for your program, please contact us as soon as you feel comfortable doing so that we work on this. I think in the space of diversion, this is where the rapid resolution part comes in. If people have got to a place where they're done and they've exhausted all those resources, then let's acknowledge that some instances will require shelter stay, but trying to keep people out of long-term homelessness, away from long-term shelter stays, and most certainly keeping people out of chronic homelessness is in our best interests and is also one of the expectations of many funders in different jurisdictions throughout the country.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to let one more question that just came in because I think it's important. What data is the most valuable to collect for diversion and prevention planning?
So there's like person and then system level data on this. I think that what I want to know on a broad sense is how successful were we at prevention and diversion over what period of time? So who are the people that we could prevent and divert? Did they come back? If they came back, what is the time frame for coming back, and could we prevent or divert again? So that's one. And then the second thing that I really want to know is the characteristics of the households that we are successful and the characteristics of the households where we tend to be not as successful. So as you'll hear, I suspect if you go to the diversion practice webinar on June, I want to say it's 23rd, but don't hold me to that, consult the first slide, as different practitioners have the opportunity to share. In my experience, what I've learned a lot is the ability to understand who's the sweet spot, and that ability to really target your scripts, your staffing, your engagement based upon the volume of people and the types of people that tend to present for prevention diversion services in your community.